The turquoise waters of the Caribbean hold secrets darker than their deepest trenches. In 2004, Emily Harper boarded the luxury cruise ship Ocean Seraph as a solo traveler seeking healing after a devastating breakup. She was a writer, trained to notice details others missed. But the questions she began asking would seal her fate forever. On her third night aboard, Emily vanished without a trace, her cabin cleaned, her belongings gone, as if she had never existed. The cruise line claimed she never boarded. Security footage mysteriously malfunctioned. Then, 8 months later, something washed up on a distant beach in the Bahamas. Something red. Something that would expose a floating nightmare that had been claiming victims for decades. This is the story of a woman who discovered the truth about what really happens when passengers disappear at sea, and paid the ultimate price for her curiosity. The summer of 2004 hung heavy with humidity over Miami, where the massive cruise ship Ocean Seraph towered above the port like a floating city of promises and escape. Its pristine white hull gleamed under the Florida sun, decorated with cheerful murals of dolphins and tropical scenes that seemed to mock the darkness that would soon unfold within its steel corridors. Emily Harper stood at the boarding terminal, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon light as she clutched a worn leather satchel that contained her most precious possessions. A leather-bound journal, a vintage voice recorder, and a collection of photographs that documented the fragments of a life she was trying to rebuild after the devastating end of a 5-year relationship. At 29, Emily possessed the kind of quiet beauty that came from intelligence rather than artifice, her green eyes reflecting a depth of observation that had served her well in her career as a freelance writer, specializing in travel and cultural stories. The decision to take this cruise alone had been both therapeutic and professional, an attempt to heal from the betrayal that had shattered her engagement while simultaneously gathering material for a series of articles about solo travel in the Caribbean. Her editor at Coastal Living had been enthusiastic about the concept, but Emily's true motivation was more personal. She needed to prove to herself that she could find peace in solitude, that her worth wasn't dependent on the validation of others. The Ocean Seraph was marketed as a luxury experience, promising 5 days of pampered relaxation as it sailed from Miami to Cozumel, Jamaica, and Nassau before returning to Florida. The ship's promotional materials emphasized its state-of-the-art amenities, world-class dining, and commitment to passenger safety. But Emily's trained eye had already begun to notice details that contradicted the carefully crafted image. The crew members seemed unusually tense for people working in what should have been a celebratory environment, their smiles appearing forced, and their interactions with passengers marked by a subtle but unmistakable wariness. As Emily made her way through the boarding process, her journalist's instincts picked up on conversations and behaviors that struck her as odd for a vacation cruise. She overheard crew members speaking in hushed tones about passenger manifests that didn't match boarding records, noticed security personnel paying unusually close attention to certain areas of the ship, and observed that some sections of the vessel were marked as off-limits to passengers without clear explanations for the restrictions. Her notebook, which she had intended to fill with observations about the joy of solo travel, began instead to document inconsistencies that suggested the Ocean Seraph harbored secrets beneath its veneer of luxury hospitality. Her cabin on Deck 7 was compact but comfortable, with a small porthole that offered views of the endless blue expanse that would be her home for the next 5 days. Emily arranged her belongings with the methodical care of someone who found comfort in order, placing her journal and recorder on the small desk where she planned to work each evening, organizing her cameras and film canisters in the dresser drawer, and hanging her clothes with the precision of someone who treated even temporary spaces as extensions of her personal sanctuary. The red silk nightgown that she had packed for this journey hung in the closet like a symbol of the self-confidence she was trying to rebuild, a reminder that she deserved beauty and luxury regardless of her romantic circumstances. The first evening aboard the Ocean Seraph was marked by a formal dinner in the main dining room, where Emily found herself seated at a table with other solo travelers who seemed to share her mix of excitement and apprehension about the journey ahead. She engaged in polite conversation with her table mates, while secretly observing the dynamics between passengers and crew, noting how certain staff members seemed to monitor conversations more carefully than their service duties would require. Her training as a journalist had taught her to trust her instincts when something felt wrong, and every interaction reinforced her growing conviction that the Ocean Seraph was not what it appeared to be. That night, as Emily sat in her cabin writing in her journal by the soft glow of the bedside lamp, she recorded her first impressions of the ship and its crew with the careful attention to detail that had made her a successful travel writer. Her entries began innocuously enough, describing the elegant decor and impressive amenities, but gradually shifted to document the subtle signs of tension and secrecy that she had observed throughout the day. She wrote about the way certain crew members seemed to avoid eye contact with passengers, about restricted areas that seemed disproportionately large for a cruise ship, and about the feeling that she was being watched even when she appeared to be alone. The voice recordings she made that first night captured not just her verbal observations, but the ambient sounds of the ship itself. The constant hum of engines and ventilation systems punctuated by footsteps in corridors, and muffled conversations that seemed to carry undertones of urgency, rather than the relaxed chatter that should characterize a luxury vacation. Emily's reporter instincts told her that she had stumbled onto something significant, though she couldn't yet determine whether the irregularities she was observing represented simple incompetence or something more sinister. As the Ocean Seraph sailed through the calm waters of the Florida Straits toward its first port of call, Emily Harper settled into her narrow bunk with the satisfaction of someone who had found a story worth investigating. Her journal entry that night concluded with a single line that would prove prophetic. "There are secrets on this ship that someone doesn't want discovered, but secrets have a way of surfacing when you know how to look for them." The gentle rocking of the vessel lulled her to sleep, but her dreams were filled with images of dark corridors and whispered conversations that seemed to carry warnings she couldn't quite understand. The second day aboard the Ocean Seraph dawned with deceptive tranquility, the Caribbean sun painting the ship's decks in golden hues that contrasted sharply with the growing unease that had taken root in Emily's consciousness during her first night at sea. She emerged from her cabin carrying her leather journal and vintage camera, determined to document whatever story was unfolding around her while maintaining the appearance of a typical solo traveler enjoying her vacation. The breakfast buffet in the main dining hall provided the perfect opportunity for observation, as crew members moved through their morning routines with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested familiarity with protocols that extended far beyond standard hospitality procedures. Emily's attention was drawn to a young Filipino man named Carlos, who worked as a server in the dining room. His nervous energy and frequent glances toward the ship's upper decks suggesting knowledge of activities that troubled him deeply. When she engaged him in casual conversation about the ship's amenities, his responses carried undertones of warning disguised as helpful advice. He suggested that she avoid certain areas of the ship after dark, mentioned that some passengers had experienced problems that weren't discussed in official reports, and recommended that she keep her cabin door locked at all times, even when she was inside. His careful phrasing and meaningful looks conveyed information that he couldn't speak directly without risking his employment or potentially his safety. The ship's security chief, a stern-faced man named Marcus Webb, whose military bearings suggested experience in situations far more serious than cruise ship incidents, seemed to appear wherever Emily went throughout the morning, his presence feeling less like coincidental encounters and more like deliberate surveillance. When she attempted to photograph some of the ship's architectural details for her travel articles, Webb materialized beside her with suggestions about better locations for pictures, subtly steering her away from areas that he claimed were either unsafe or under maintenance. His explanations were plausible but delivered with an intensity that suggested the restrictions were more significant than he was willing to acknowledge. During lunch, Emily encountered Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, an elderly widow from Phoenix, who had been taking annual cruises for nearly 2 decades and possessed the kind of institutional memory that made her observations particularly valuable. Mrs. Kellerman spoke in the careful manner of someone who had learned to watch her words, but her comments about changes in cruise ship operations over the years contained implications that chilled Emily's blood. She mentioned passengers who had disappeared during previous voyages, incidents that had been explained as accidents or medical emergencies, but had left families with unanswered questions and suspicious circumstances that were never adequately investigated. The afternoon brought Emily's first direct confrontation with the ship's darker realities when she attempted to access a restricted area near the engine compartments, drawn by sounds that seemed inconsistent with normal mechanical operations. The security guard who intercepted her was polite but firm, explaining that the area was off-limits due to safety regulations, but his nervous fidgeting and refusal to make eye contact suggested that the restrictions had nothing to do with passenger welfare. His insistence that she return to the public areas of the ship was accompanied by veiled threats about the consequences of violating ship policies, making it clear that curiosity was not welcome aboard the Ocean Seraph. That evening, as Emily prepared for the formal dinner that was scheduled in the ship's grand ballroom, she reviewed her notes and recordings from the day, trying to piece together a coherent picture from the fragments of information and odd behaviors she had documented. Her journal entries revealed a pattern of deliberate obfuscation and intimidation that suggested the crew was protecting secrets that went far beyond simple operational irregularities. The voice recordings captured not just her observations, but ambient conversations in multiple languages, hushed discussions that seemed to reference activities occurring in restricted areas of the ship during hours when passengers were expected to be sleeping or occupied with entertainment. During dinner, Mrs. Kellerman approached Emily's table with the urgency of someone who had made a difficult decision, her weathered hands trembling as she leaned close to whisper information that she insisted could not be overheard by the wrong people. The elderly woman revealed that she had been keeping her own informal records of cruise ship incidents over the years, documenting cases where passengers had vanished under circumstances that defied the official explanations provided by cruise lines and maritime authorities. Her records suggested that the Ocean Seraph had an unusually high rate of passenger disappearances, with at least 7 people having gone missing during voyages over the past 6 years. All of them solo travelers who had been asking questions or showing interest in areas of the ship that were supposed to remain hidden from passenger observation. Mrs. Kellerman's revelations included specific details about the ship's layout that weren't shown on passenger maps, describing cargo holds and service areas that had been modified for purposes that weren't related to standard cruise operations. She spoke of seeing passengers being escorted to these areas by security personnel during late-night hours, individuals who were never seen again, but whose disappearances were explained as medical emergencies or voluntary departures at ports of call. Her voice carried the weight of years of accumulated suspicion and fear, the knowledge that she possessed information that could be dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. As the evening progressed, Emily became increasingly aware that her conversations with Mrs. Kellerman and her obvious interest in the ship's irregular activities had not gone unnoticed by the crew members who moved through the dining room with apparent casualness but unmistakable attention to their discussion. The feeling of being watched intensified throughout the dinner service, with security personnel positioning themselves at strategic locations that would allow them to monitor Emily's movements while maintaining plausible deniability about their surveillance activities. By the time she returned to her cabin that night, Emily understood that she had crossed a threshold from curious observer to potential threat, in the eyes of whoever was responsible for maintaining the Ocean Seraph's carefully guarded secrets. Her final journal entry of the second day was written with the growing awareness that she might have stumbled into a situation far more dangerous than she had initially realized. But her determination to uncover the truth had only intensified with each new piece of evidence. She documented her conversations, her observations, and her growing conviction that the Ocean Seraph was being used for activities that violated both maritime law and basic human decency. The last line of her entry that night carried a prescient warning that she couldn't have known would prove prophetic. "If something happens to me on this ship, it won't be an accident, and someone needs to make sure the truth comes out, no matter what official explanation they provide." The third day aboard the Ocean Seraph began with an atmosphere of heightened tension that Emily could feel the moment she stepped out of her cabin, as if the ship itself had shifted into a more dangerous configuration during the night hours when passengers were supposed to be safely asleep in their quarters. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck that seemed to hide more than they revealed, and Emily noticed that several crew members who had been friendly and approachable during her first 2 days now avoided eye contact entirely, their body language suggesting they had received specific instructions about how to interact with certain passengers. The change was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained in observation, and it confirmed her growing suspicion that her investigative activities had not gone unnoticed by the ship's authorities. Carlos, the Filipino server who had provided cryptic warnings during their previous encounters, appeared genuinely frightened when Emily approached him during breakfast service, his hands shaking as he poured her coffee, and his eyes darting nervously toward the dining room's exits, as if he expected to be interrupted at any moment. When she attempted to continue their conversation from the previous day, he whispered urgently that she needed to be more careful about who she spoke with and where she chose to conduct her conversations. His broken English carried undertones of desperation as he explained that passengers who asked too many questions sometimes experienced problems that weren't documented in official reports, and that she should consider cutting her voyage short at the next port of call if she valued her safety. Mrs. Kellerman was notably absent from her usual breakfast table, and when Emily inquired about the elderly woman's whereabouts, she was told by staff members that Mrs. Kellerman was feeling unwell and would be taking her meals in her cabin for the remainder of the voyage. The explanation was delivered with the kind of rehearsed uniformity that suggested coordination among crew members, and Emily's attempts to send a message or visit the woman were firmly but politely discouraged by staff who claimed to be following medical isolation protocols. The sudden inaccessibility of her primary source of information about the ship's dark history felt less like coincidence and more like deliberate intervention by authorities who wanted to prevent further exchange of sensitive information. The afternoon brought Emily's most significant breakthrough when she managed to access a service corridor that connected the passenger areas to restricted sections of the ship, following maintenance sounds that had been bothering her since her first night aboard. The narrow passage was dimly lit and filled with the mechanical noise of ventilation systems and engines, but it also carried sounds that were distinctly human. Muffled voices speaking in urgent tones, the scraping of heavy objects being moved, and what sounded like someone crying or pleading in a language she couldn't identify. The corridor itself showed signs of recent construction, with newer walls and flooring that suggested significant modifications to the ship's original design had been made to accommodate activities that weren't part of standard cruise operations. Emily's exploration of the service area led her to a section of the ship that didn't appear on any passenger maps, a maze of rooms and corridors that seemed designed for containment rather than hospitality. The doors were equipped with electronic locks rather than the simple keycard systems used in passenger areas, and small windows revealed spaces that looked more like holding cells than crew quarters. The air in this section carried odors that had nothing to do with ocean travel. Disinfectant, fear, and something organic that suggested human habitation under unpleasant circumstances. Her camera captured images of the modified spaces, but the low light and her growing anxiety about discovery made it difficult to document everything she was seeing with the thoroughness her journalist training demanded. The discovery that would change everything came when Emily found an unlocked storage room that contained personal belongings from multiple individuals, items that clearly hadn't belonged to current passengers or crew members. Suitcases bearing luggage tags from various cruise lines, personal jewelry, clothing, and identification documents were stored in organized rows that suggested systematic collection over an extended period. Among the items, she found a driver's license belonging to a woman who had allegedly left the ship voluntarily at a previous port, along with personal effects that no one would willingly abandon during a vacation. The implications were staggering and terrifying. The Ocean Seraph was somehow connected to the disappearances of multiple passengers over an extended period, and their belongings were being retained as evidence of activities that had nothing to do with legitimate cruise operations. Her hands trembling with the magnitude of what she had discovered, Emily began photographing the stored belongings with the urgency of someone who understood that she might not have another opportunity to document such evidence. Each click of her camera shutter seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space, and she found herself constantly checking over her shoulder for signs that her unauthorized presence had been detected by security systems or patrol personnel. The personal items told stories of interrupted journeys and abandoned lives. A child's stuffed animal, a wedding ring still in its box, medication bottles with names that didn't match any current passenger manifest, all arranged with the clinical precision of someone cataloging evidence rather than storing lost property. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside sent Emily into a panic that made her realize how far from safety she had ventured in pursuit of the truth about the Ocean Seraph's secret activities. She managed to conceal herself behind a stack of storage containers just as Security Chief Webb entered the room with two other crew members, their conversation revealing that they were conducting routine inspections of areas that passengers were never supposed to access. Their discussion included references to schedules for processing and transfers that had nothing to do with normal cruise ship operations, along with mentions of specific passengers who required special attention during the remainder of the voyage. Webb's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, as he instructed his subordinates about increased surveillance of certain areas and passengers, specifically mentioning a need to monitor solo travelers who had been showing unusual interest in restricted sections of the ship. Emily's blood ran cold as she realized that she was almost certainly among the passengers who had attracted their attention, and that her investigation had progressed from curious observation to active espionage in an environment where discovery could have consequences far more serious than simple embarrassment. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with references to communication blackouts and contingency procedures that suggested the crew was prepared to deal with threats to their operational security through methods that would never appear in official incident reports. As the security team finally left the storage area, Emily remained hidden until she was certain they had moved far enough away to allow her safe passage back to the passenger sections of the ship. Her escape through the service corridors was accomplished with the careful stealth of someone who understood that her life might depend on remaining undetected, but the knowledge she now carried felt like a weight that threatened to crush her with its implications. The Ocean Seraph was not just a cruise ship with irregular operations. It was the center of a systematic program that involved the disappearance of passengers under circumstances that were being covered up through official channels that extended far beyond the ship's immediate crew and management. The fourth and final night of Emily Harper's life aboard the Ocean Seraph began with a dinner that felt more like a last meal than a social occasion, though she had no way of knowing that the forces she had inadvertently set in motion were already moving to silence her permanently. She sat alone at her assigned table in the grand dining room, picking at her food while her mind raced through the implications of what she had discovered in the ship's hidden storage areas. The personal belongings of missing passengers represented evidence of crimes that went far beyond simple negligence or accident, suggesting a systematic operation that had been claiming victims for years while maintaining the facade of a luxury cruise experience. Her journal entry that evening was written with the desperate urgency of someone who understood that she might not survive to tell her story through conventional means, each word carefully chosen to convey maximum information in minimum space. She documented the locations of the restricted areas she had accessed, described the personal belongings she had found, and recorded the conversation between Security Chief Webb and his subordinates that had revealed the existence of protocols for dealing with problematic passengers. Her handwriting, normally neat and controlled, showed signs of stress and fear as she wrote. But her journalist's training kept her focused on creating a record that could serve as evidence if something happened to prevent her from reporting the story herself. The voice recordings she made that night captured not just her own observations, but the ambient sounds of a ship operating according to schedules that had nothing to do with passenger comfort or entertainment. Through her cabin's thin walls, she could hear movement in corridors that were supposed to be empty, hushed conversations in languages she couldn't identify, and the mechanical sounds of equipment that seemed too heavy and complex for normal cruise ship operations. Her recorder picked up electronic beeps and radio communications that suggested coordination between different areas of the ship, activities that were being conducted with military precision, while passengers slept unaware of the dangers surrounding them. Carlos found her during the late dinner service, his approach so nervous and furtive that Emily immediately understood he was risking significant personal consequences by making contact with her again. His whispered warning was delivered with the urgency of someone who had learned that time was running out, explaining that she needed to find a way off the ship immediately, that plans were being made that would ensure she never reached the next port of call. He pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand before disappearing back into the kitchen. His message, written in broken English that nonetheless conveyed critical information about emergency procedures and areas of the ship where passengers could potentially hide if they needed to avoid security personnel. The note from Carlos revealed the existence of a network among certain crew members who had become uncomfortable with the ship's illegal activities, but were trapped by employment contracts and immigration status that made them vulnerable to retaliation if they spoke out. He had provided a rough map of service corridors that could be used to move through the ship without being detected by security cameras, along with information about shift changes and patrol schedules that might allow a passenger to reach communication equipment or emergency beacons. The note concluded with a desperate plea for Emily to destroy the information after reading it, and to trust no one in any official capacity aboard the Ocean Seraph. As Emily returned to her cabin after dinner, she noticed that the lock mechanism on her door had been tampered with, subtle scratches around the key card reader suggesting that someone had gained unauthorized access to her quarters while she was eating. A careful inspection revealed that her belongings had been searched with professional thoroughness, items moved just enough to indicate examination, but carefully replaced to avoid obvious evidence of intrusion. Her journal and voice recorder remained where she had left them, but she suspected that their contents had been reviewed, and that her documentation of the ship's illegal activities was now known to the authorities she had been trying to expose. The realization that her cabin was no longer secure sent Emily into a state of controlled panic, as she gathered the most critical evidence and prepared to relocate to one of the hiding places that Carlos had identified in his note. She photographed the most important pages of her journal and concealed the film canisters in different locations throughout her clothing and personal belongings, understanding that if she was captured or killed, the evidence needed to survive to reach people who could act on it. Her camera and the most incriminating photographs were hidden in a pillowcase that she planned to carry with her, while backup film was concealed in the lining of her suitcase, where it might be overlooked during a hasty search. The plan she formulated for surviving the night involved moving through the service corridors to reach a communications room where she might be able to send a distress signal or at least leave evidence of her discoveries where it would be found by investigators if something happened to her. Carlos's map showed a route that avoided the main security checkpoints, but it required her to pass through areas of the ship where her presence would be impossible to explain if she was discovered. The timing would be critical, as she needed to move during shift changes when surveillance would be momentarily relaxed, but before the night patrol routines that Webb had mentioned during his conversation in the storage room. At 11:47 p.m., Emily made the decision that would seal her fate, leaving her cabin for the last time with her camera, her most critical evidence, and the desperate hope that she could somehow survive long enough to expose the truth about the Ocean Seraph's operations. Her final act before departing was to hide a note in her mattress, a message that would never be found because her cabin would be thoroughly cleaned and her belongings removed before any official investigation could take place. The note contained the locations of her hidden evidence and a plea for justice that would remain unread for decades. A voice crying out from beyond the grave for someone to remember that Emily Harper had lived, had fought for the truth, and had been silenced by forces that valued profits and secrecy over human life. The corridor outside her cabin was dimly lit and eerily quiet as Emily began her final journey through the bowels of the Ocean Seraph, following Carlos's hand-drawn map toward a confrontation with evil that she hoped to document but would not survive. Her footsteps echoed softly against the metal walls, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the stillness as she moved deeper into sections of the ship where screams would go unheard, and disappearances would be explained away by officials who had perfected the art of making inconvenient people vanish without a trace. The service corridors beneath the Ocean Seraph's passenger decks formed a labyrinthine network that Emily navigated with the careful precision of someone who understood that a single wrong turn could lead to discovery and death. The map Carlos had provided proved accurate in its depiction of the ship's hidden arteries, but it couldn't convey the oppressive atmosphere that permeated these spaces, where the normal sounds of ocean travel were replaced by mechanical humming and the distant echo of activities that passengers were never meant to witness. Her camera hung heavy around her neck, its weight both reassuring and terrifying as she moved through darkness, illuminated only by emergency lighting that cast everything in a sickly red glow. The first indication that Emily was not alone in the service areas came as she approached what Carlos had marked as a communications junction, where she hoped to find equipment that could transmit a distress signal beyond the ship's internal networks. Voices echoed from somewhere ahead, speaking in English with accents that suggested international crew members discussing procedures that had nothing to do with passenger safety or comfort. She pressed herself against the cold metal wall, straining to hear words that would confirm her worst suspicions about the Ocean Seraph's true purpose and the fate that awaited passengers who asked too many questions. The conversation she overheard included references to processing schedules and disposal protocols that sent ice through her veins as she realized that her investigation had uncovered evidence of something far more sinister than simple passenger disappearances. The crew members spoke with the casual efficiency of people who had performed these tasks many times before, discussing logistics and timing with the kind of professional detachment that suggested they were following established procedures rather than improvising responses to an unusual situation. Their discussion included specific mentions of passengers who had been selected for special handling during the current voyage, and Emily's blood ran cold as she recognized descriptions that seemed to match her own profile. Security Chief Webb's voice emerged from the group with the authority of someone directing operations that extended far beyond normal cruise ship security, his instructions revealing the existence of holding areas and processing facilities that didn't appear on any passenger deck plans. He spoke about maintaining operational security while ensuring that no evidence would remain to complicate official investigations, referencing previous successes in making problematic passengers disappear without leaving traces that could be connected to the ship's legitimate operations. The clinical precision of his language suggested experience with systematic elimination of witnesses, activities that had been refined through years of practice. Emily's hands trembled as she raised her camera to photograph the junction where the voices were coming from, understanding that visual evidence of the crew's coordination might be crucial for any future investigation, assuming she survived to provide it to authorities who weren't complicit in the Ocean Seraph's operations. The flash from her camera seemed impossibly bright in the dimly lit corridor, its brief illumination revealing details of the ship's infrastructure that confirmed her suspicions about modifications made to accommodate activities that had nothing to do with passenger comfort. The mechanical click of the shutter mechanism echoed with finality that made her realize she had just announced her presence to people who were discussing plans for her elimination. The immediate silence that followed her photograph was more terrifying than any alarm or pursuit could have been. The absence of conversations suggesting that the crew members had heard the camera and were now moving to investigate the source of the unexpected sound. Emily's training as a journalist had prepared her for dangerous situations, but nothing in her experience had equipped her to handle the reality of being hunted through the bowels of a ship by people who possessed both the means and motivation to ensure she never reached shore alive. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to orient herself using Carlos's map, while listening for sounds that would indicate the direction and speed of her pursuers. The chase began with the systematic efficiency of professionals who understood the ship's layout far better than any passenger could hope to, their coordination evident in the way they moved to block escape routes while maintaining communication through handheld radios that allowed them to track Emily's movements without losing contact with each other. She could hear their footsteps echoing through multiple corridors as they implemented search patterns designed to funnel her toward areas where capture would be inevitable. Their calm professionalism more frightening than any display of anger or violence could have been. Emily's desperate flight through the service corridors was guided by adrenaline and the fragmentary information Carlos had provided. But she quickly realized that her pursuers possessed advantages that made escape virtually impossible. They knew every passage, every dead end, every hiding place that might have provided temporary refuge from their methodical advance. Her camera bounced against her chest as she ran, its weight a constant reminder of the evidence she carried and the importance of keeping it away from people who would destroy it, along with any trace of her investigation. The sound of radio communications behind her revealed that additional crew members were being called to assist in what was clearly a well-practiced procedure for dealing with passengers who had discovered information that threatened the ship's operations. Emily caught fragments of conversation that included references to containment protocols and cleanup procedures that suggested her disappearance would be handled with the same systematic efficiency that had apparently been applied to previous cases. The realization that she was not the first passenger to find herself in this situation provided no comfort, only the knowledge that her pursuers had refined their methods through experience with other victims who had paid the ultimate price for their curiosity. As Emily reached what she hoped would be a communication room where she might send a final message about her discoveries, she found instead a space that had been converted into something far more sinister. A holding area equipped with restraints and monitoring equipment that left no doubt about its purpose. The room contained evidence of recent use, bloodstains that had been imperfectly cleaned, and personal belongings that suggested other passengers had been brought here during their final hours aboard the Ocean Seraph. Her camera captured these final images, even as she heard her pursuers approaching, their voices now carrying the satisfaction of hunters who had cornered their prey in exactly the location they had intended. The holding room where Emily found herself trapped represented the culmination of a nightmare that had begun as a simple vacation cruise, its sterile walls and restraint equipment telling a story of systematic violence that had been hidden beneath the Ocean Seraph's facade of luxury hospitality for years. Her camera continued to click even as Security Chief Webb and his team surrounded her, their faces showing the cold satisfaction of professionals who had successfully completed a familiar task. The evidence she had gathered during her investigation now seemed pathetically inadequate against the reality of her situation. But her journalist's instincts compelled her to continue documenting, even as she understood that her photographs might never be seen by anyone who could act on them. Webb's voice carried the authority of someone who had orchestrated similar scenes many times before, as he explained to Emily that her curiosity had led her into a situation that could only end one way. His words delivered with the clinical detachment of someone discussing a routine business procedure rather than murder. He revealed that the Ocean Seraph had been modified years earlier to serve as more than a cruise ship, operating as a mobile platform for activities that took advantage of international waters, where jurisdiction was unclear and investigations could be easily frustrated by bureaucratic complications. Emily's investigation had uncovered only a fraction of the ship's true operations, But even that limited knowledge made her too dangerous to be allowed to leave alive. The revelation that the ship's passenger disappearances were not random accidents, but part of a systematic program sent Emily into a state of controlled terror that nevertheless sharpened her focus on gathering final pieces of evidence that might somehow survive her inevitable death. Webb explained with professional pride how the operation worked, describing how solo travelers were selected based on criteria that made their disappearances easy to explain and difficult to investigate. Emily's profile had made her an ideal target: a single woman with no immediate family obligations, a journalist whose work often took her to remote locations where communications might be interrupted, and someone whose recent personal problems provided plausible explanations for depression or reckless behavior that might lead to suicide. The system that had been perfected aboard the Ocean Seraph involved careful documentation of passenger behavior, identification of individuals who posed potential security risks, and systematic elimination of threats before they could reach authorities who might take their allegations seriously. Webb's team had refined their methods through years of practice, developing procedures for disposing of bodies and belongings that left no evidence for investigators while maintaining plausible stories that satisfied families and officials who were either incompetent or complicit. Emily's investigation had actually aided their work by documenting her own suspicious behavior and providing material that could be used to support theories about her instability or involvement in dangerous activities. As Webb's monologue continued, Emily managed to activate her voice recorder one final time, concealing the device in her clothing where it might record evidence of the crimes that were about to be committed against her. The recorder captured not just Webb's confession, but the casual conversation of crew members who discussed their activities with the routine professionalism of people who had found a profitable niche in international crime. Their discussion revealed that the Ocean Seraph was only one component of a larger network that included multiple ships and shore-based facilities, all coordinated by organizations that specialized in making inconvenient people disappear without leaving traces that could compromise their operations. The photographs Emily had taken throughout her investigation now represented the only hope that her death might eventually lead to justice, assuming they could somehow survive the systematic destruction of evidence that would follow her disappearance. Webb's team had procedures for eliminating all traces of problematic passengers, but Emily's training as a journalist had taught her methods for hiding evidence that might escape their attention. Her camera and recorder were obvious targets for confiscation, but the film canisters she had concealed throughout her belongings might survive if her captors were overconfident about their ability to eliminate all evidence. The crew members who had participated in Emily's capture showed varying degrees of comfort with their role in what was clearly a murder operation, some displaying the casual indifference of experienced killers, while others seemed troubled by their involvement in activities that went far beyond their original job descriptions. Carlos was notably absent from the group, suggesting that his attempt to help Emily had either been discovered and punished, or that he had been deliberately excluded from the final phase of the operation to protect him from knowledge that might make him unreliable in future situations. Webb's final preparations for disposing of Emily revealed the sophisticated methods that had made previous disappearances appear accidental, including equipment for weighting bodies to ensure they sank in deep water, and chemicals that would accelerate decomposition to eliminate DNA evidence that might survive prolonged immersion. The operation had been planned with the attention to detail that characterized all successful criminal enterprises, taking advantage of the Ocean Seraph's legitimate operations to provide cover for activities that generated substantial profits from clients who were willing to pay premium prices for guaranteed elimination of problematic individuals. As Emily faced the final moments of her life, she took comfort in knowing that her investigation had at least documented some of the truth about the Ocean Seraph's operations, even if she would not survive to see justice done. Her last conscious thought was a prayer that someone would eventually find the evidence she had hidden, and that her death would not be completely meaningless. That the red silk nightgown and personal belongings that would soon be washing ashore on distant beaches might somehow serve as testimony to crimes that had been hidden beneath the surface of the Caribbean's deceptively peaceful waters. The Ocean Seraph continued its journey through the night, carrying its cargo of secrets toward ports where new victims would board, unaware that they were stepping aboard a vessel where curiosity could be fatal, and questions could lead to disappearances that would puzzle their families for decades to come. The months following Emily Harper's disappearance from the Ocean Seraph passed with the bureaucratic efficiency that had been perfected to handle such cases. Her absence from the world explained through official channels that satisfied legal requirements while avoiding uncomfortable questions about the cruise line's actual operations. Margaret Harper, Emily's mother, received notification that her daughter had apparently suffered a mental health crisis during the voyage and had taken her own life by jumping overboard during the night hours when surveillance was limited and rescue operations would be impossible. The explanation was delivered with practiced sympathy by officials who specialized in providing closure to families while protecting corporate interests that extended far beyond simple passenger safety concerns. The cruise line's response to Emily's disappearance followed protocols that had been refined through years of experience with similar incidents, involving immediate removal of all her belongings from the ship before any official investigation could begin. Her cabin was thoroughly sanitized, and her personal effects were reportedly disposed of according to maritime regulations that governed the handling of materials from deceased passengers, though no family member was ever allowed to verify what items had actually been recovered or to examine evidence that might contradict the official suicide determination. The Ocean Seraph continued its scheduled itinerary without interruption, its operations undisturbed by the loss of a single passenger whose death added only one more entry to insurance files that documented the acceptable casualty rate for luxury cruise operations. The investigation conducted by Bahamian authorities was perfunctory at best, hampered by jurisdictional complications that made it difficult to determine which nation's laws applied to incidents occurring in international waters aboard ships registered in countries chosen specifically for their lenient oversight of maritime activities. Emily's case was closed within weeks, her death officially attributed to suicide by drowning with contributing factors that included recent personal problems and possible substance abuse, conclusions that were based entirely on testimony from crew members whose reliability was never seriously questioned by investigators who seemed eager to avoid complications that might interfere with the profitable cruise industry. But the ocean, unlike human institutions, proved incapable of keeping secrets indefinitely, and the evidence that Emily had died to preserve began to surface in ways that would eventually challenge the official narrative of her disappearance. In April 2005, nearly 8 months after her vanishing from the Ocean Seraph, James and Patricia Westbrook, a retired couple from Toronto enjoying their annual vacation in the Bahamas, made a discovery during their morning walk along the pristine beaches of Long Island that would resurrect questions about maritime safety and corporate accountability that powerful interests had worked to suppress. The red silk fabric that caught Patricia's attention as it fluttered in the surf was partially buried in sand that had been deposited by winter storms. Its color faded but still recognizable as the luxurious material that Emily had packed for her cruise, as a symbol of the self-confidence she was trying to rebuild. The nightgown had been transformed by months of exposure to salt water and sand into a ghostly remnant of its former beauty, but forensic analysis would later confirm that traces of human hair found tangled in the fabric matched Emily's DNA profile, providing the first physical evidence that her death had not occurred in the manner described by official reports. The discovery sent shockwaves through the tourist community on Long Island, where locals had grown accustomed to finding debris from ships and aircraft that had been claimed by the Atlantic's unpredictable currents, but rarely encountered evidence of human tragedies that had been deliberately concealed by corporate and government authorities. The Westbrooks contacted Bahamian police immediately, but their report was received with the kind of bureaucratic indifference that suggested officials were reluctant to reopen investigations that had already been resolved to everyone's satisfaction, except the families of the deceased. The lapis lazuli pendant that James found buried in the sand near the nightgown provided even more compelling evidence that Emily's personal belongings had somehow survived her supposed suicide. Its distinctive blue stone and silver setting matching photographs that her mother had provided to investigators during their perfunctory examination of her disappearance. The pendant had been a college graduation gift that Emily never removed, making its presence on a Bahamian beach nearly impossible to explain through the official theory that she had jumped from the cruise ship in deep water hundreds of miles from any coastline. The jewelry's condition suggested prolonged exposure to ocean currents rather than direct disposal, supporting theories that Emily's body and belongings had been weighted and dumped, but had somehow separated during their journey to the ocean floor. Oceanographic experts consulted about the discovery confirmed that currents in the Caribbean could indeed carry objects from the Ocean Seraph's regular route to the beaches of Long Island, but only under specific conditions that involved multiple storm systems and seasonal variations that made such transport relatively rare. The timing and location of the discoveries suggested that Emily's belongings had been dumped in deep water during the period when she was reported missing, supporting theories that her death had been carefully planned and executed by individuals with detailed knowledge of ocean currents and disposal techniques that would minimize the chance of evidence washing ashore. Margaret Harper's response to news of the beach discoveries was a mixture of grief and vindication. Her years of questioning the official explanation for her daughter's death, finally supported by physical evidence that contradicted every aspect of the suicide theory. She had never accepted that Emily, despite her recent personal problems, would have taken her own life without leaving some kind of message or explanation, particularly given her strong relationships with family members and her promising career as a journalist. The discovery of Emily's belongings on a distant beach suggested that her death had been neither suicide nor accident, but murder carried out by individuals who possessed both the means and motivation to eliminate a passenger who had discovered information that threatened their operations. The red silk nightgown became a symbol of injustice that would haunt the cruise industry for years to come, its image reproduced in newspaper articles and television reports that questioned the adequacy of maritime safety regulations and the accountability of cruise lines operating in international waters. The fabric that Emily had chosen as a symbol of her renewed self-confidence had been transformed by tragedy into evidence of crimes that powerful interests continued to deny. Its survival and discovery, serving as testimony from beyond the grave about corruption and violence that had been hidden beneath the surface of the Caribbean's deceptively peaceful waters. The discovery of Emily's belongings on Long Island Beach catalyzed a chain of events that would ultimately expose the Ocean Seraph's criminal operations, though justice would prove as elusive as the truth had been for nearly 2 decades. Margaret Harper used the physical evidence to pressure authorities into reopening her daughter's case, hiring private investigators and maritime lawyers who specialized in cruise ship incidents to challenge the official suicide determination that had protected the ship's operators from liability. Her campaign gained momentum when other families of missing passengers began to emerge from the shadows, sharing stories of loved ones who had vanished under similar circumstances and received equally unsatisfactory explanations from cruise line officials and maritime authorities. The breakthrough came in 2023 when investigative journalist David Chen began researching maritime disappearances for a documentary series about crimes in international waters, his investigation revealing patterns that had been invisible when individual cases were examined in isolation. Chen's analysis of passenger manifests, crew records, and incident reports spanning 2 decades revealed that the Ocean Seraph had experienced an extraordinary number of single-passenger disappearances, all involving solo travelers who had exhibited behavior that crew members described as suspicious or problematic. The statistical analysis suggested that the probability of such incidents being coincidental was virtually zero, providing mathematical proof that the ship had been used as a platform for systematic elimination of unwanted individuals. Chen's investigation also uncovered evidence that the Ocean Seraph had been sold and renamed multiple times since Emily's disappearance, its ownership transferred through shell companies and offshore corporations that made it difficult to trace responsibility for its operations. The ship continued to operate under different names and flags of convenience. Its routes and passenger demographics adjusted to avoid scrutiny from authorities who might recognize patterns that connected it to previous incidents. The systematic effort to obscure the vessel's history suggested that its owners understood the criminal liability they faced and were taking sophisticated measures to prevent investigation of their activities. The most significant development came when Chen managed to locate Carlos Mendez, the Filipino crew member who had tried to warn Emily during her final days aboard the ship. Mendez had been living in hiding for nearly 20 years, his immigration status and fear of retaliation having kept him silent about what he had witnessed during his employment on the Ocean Seraph. His testimony, recorded in a secure location with legal protections, provided the first insider account of the ship's criminal operations, including detailed descriptions of the holding areas that Emily had photographed and the systematic procedures used to eliminate passengers who posed security risks. Mendez's revelations confirmed that Emily had not been the ship's only victim, describing a network of corrupt crew members and passengers who had participated in what amounted to a floating murder-for-hire operation that catered to wealthy clients seeking untraceable elimination of business rivals, inconvenient family members, and potential witnesses to other crimes. The Ocean Seraph's legitimate cruise operations provided perfect cover for activities that generated enormous profits while operating in legal gray areas where prosecution was nearly impossible due to jurisdictional complications and the difficulty of gathering evidence from crime scenes that had been thousands of miles from any coastline. The legal proceedings that followed Chen's documentary were complicated by the passage of time and the deliberate destruction of evidence. But the combination of physical evidence from the beach discovery and Mendez's testimony was sufficient to convince federal prosecutors to bring charges against surviving members of the conspiracy. Several crew members were arrested on various charges related to maritime crimes, while the corporate entities that had operated the Ocean Seraph faced civil liability that would ultimately result in settlements worth millions of dollars to the families of victims whose disappearances had been systematically concealed for decades. The ship itself was finally seized by international maritime authorities and subjected to the kind of thorough forensic examination that should have been conducted years earlier, revealing extensive modifications that confirmed everything Emily had documented during her fatal investigation. Hidden compartments, disposal equipment, and holding areas were discovered throughout the vessel, along with trace evidence that linked it to multiple disappearances across 2 decades of criminal operation. The physical evidence validated Emily's observations and photography, proving that her death had not been in vain despite the years of official cover-up that had protected her killers. Margaret Harper lived to see her daughter's vindication, though justice came too late to restore the years of grief and uncertainty that had defined her life since Emily's disappearance. At the age of 78, she stood on the courthouse steps after the final verdict was announced, holding a photograph of Emily and the red silk nightgown that had washed ashore in the Bahamas nearly 20 years earlier. Her statement to the press was simple but profound. "The sea tried to hide my daughter's murder, but the tide brought back the truth." Emily's voice has finally been heard. The Ocean Seraph case became a watershed moment in maritime law enforcement, leading to new regulations and oversight procedures designed to prevent similar operations from exploiting the legal loopholes that had protected criminal enterprises operating in international waters. But questions remained unanswered about the scope of the conspiracy and the number of victims whose disappearances had been concealed by official indifference and corporate corruption. Emily's camera and recorder were never recovered, leaving investigators to wonder what additional evidence might still be hidden in the depths of the Caribbean, waiting for currents and tides to carry the truth back to shores where justice might finally be possible. The red silk nightgown, preserved as evidence in a federal courthouse, stands as a monument to the power of persistence and the ocean's inability to keep secrets forever, a reminder that some truths are too important to remain buried beneath the waves of official silence and corporate protection.